Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for craftworldeldar.com. I'm Brent, and this is the unit focus video on the Aeldari Wayleaper. Now, in these unit focus videos, I talk about what the unit is, its job on the table, obstacles to using it well, and how to play it tactically. Together with Farseers, Aeldari Wayleapers make up the top brass of the Aeldari war machine. Farseers look into the future and advise Autarchs on tactical issues, but ultimately, Autarchs are the generals. They are superlative strategists who have spent many human lifetimes studying the art of war, and in addition, they have walked many paths of Cain. Although they are now on the path of command, they were once various aspect warriors, which informs not only their strategic prowess, but also makes them badasses with access to a lot of different war gear options, such that they are highly customizable, which is fun both from a tactical perspective, but also from a narrative perspective, right? So although these unit focus videos really are about tactical play and how to get the most out of these units with an eye towards trying to win games against somebody who's trying to do the same thing, it's also true that Autarchs are just super fun models for narrative play because you can build one that tells a story or is consistent with the story for your chosen craft world. So if you play Sam Han, maybe you want your Autarch on a bike. I play Ibrasil, and so I have my tactical Autarch fitted out for more competitive and tournament play, but then I have like a narrative Ibrasili Autarch who obviously needs to have a Banshee Blade. There are 3 different Autarch data cards. We are only talking about the Wayleaper, right? So there's the Foot Autarch that's actually just a Wayleaper, but with no wings/jump pack. For you newer players or those coming back after several editions off, in earlier editions, Autarchs had different rules if they had like the Warp Spider jump pack rather than the Swooping Hawk wings. They're now just the same. A Wayleaper is an Autarch that has either wings or a warp generator jump pack, and then you can take the Autarch on the bike. So it's 3 different data cards, and they all have different abilities despite having similar stat lines and relatively similar loadout options. But what makes the Wayleaper obviously the best is its mobility combined with the lone operative rule, which makes it untargetable outside of 12 inches. And not only is it the best of the Autarchs, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the Foot Autarch and the Bike Autarch really don't make the grade for competitive play, whereas the Wayleaper might actually be the strongest auto-include Aeldari unit in the entire index. There are a lot of A-lister units. It's one of many A-list units. But while there are GT winning Aeldari lists that do not include the Avatar of Cain, or do not include Night Spinners, or do not include Wraithguard with cannons, or do not include the Yinkarn, there are even some that don't have Farseers. But I don't know if there's ever been one that didn't have an Autarch Wayleaper. I'm sure there's something out there. There's an exception to every rule. But this unit, it's just fabulous. There's so much you can do with it. And if you are a newer player who isn't currently making use of a Wayleaper, I'm going to make a case for including one in your list. And if you are a veteran tournament player or just veteran player who plays tactical 40K in addition to narrative 40K, I think I may have at least one trick that you're not currently using. Some of you Autarchs out there are already going to know all my tricks. But I hope I have at least something to share that's going to make this video also useful for veteran players. Before we take a quick look at the stat line and the abilities, I'm just going to run you through the jobs that the Wayleaper does on the table. Arguably, there are 4, right? So the first is just to be a CP engine. So all Autarchs have this ability, superlative strategist, that causes them to generate an extra command. Oh, it's called Path of Command now, excuse me. That causes them to generate an extra command point at the beginning of your command phase. So you're going to be getting 2 on your turn, not 1 on your turn, and then 1 on your opponent's turn. And this is, in many builds alone, a reason to include this model. It completely changes your tactical options, having half again as many command points over the course of the game. And there are certain units that this synergizes especially well with, in part because you really simply cannot use Fire and Fade effectively unless you have an Autarch. Fire and Fade is our only stratagem that costs 2 CP to use out of the gate. And so in order for the economy of that to work, you really need to be generating more. So if you're running, say, fire prisms and you need for both prisms to shoot from the perspective of one prism and then duck that prism out of line of sight with fire and fade, well, you need an Autarch to make that viable. If you're using the fire and fade trick to rocket the avatar up the board or Wraithguard up the board to make up for the slow movement on the Wraithguard. In my unit focus video on the Wraithguard, I talked about that trick, and I mentioned that you need an Autarch Wayleaper to make that work. Or if you're just relying on having extra CP to always do Overwatch and always do Phantasm, and also be able to use lightning fast in certain situations, it makes sense. It synergizes really well with some of the other best units in the Codex because it's a CP engine. Job number 2, the Autarch Wayleaper is an objective holder, particularly a backfield objective holder in the early part of the game. If there's an objective completely out in the open, or even if it's not completely out in the open, just your opponent can get a bead on it with one turn of movement because of the lone operative ability, which makes the model untargetable outside of 12 inches. You can just jump your Autarch Wayleaper on there and just be untargetable. It's kind of a bummer that the regular foot Autarch doesn't also have this. The trade-off is that one has leader, but there's nothing good for it to lead, really. So it's hardly a good exchange for the regular foot Autarch. I think you just need a lone operative. I think pretty much all armies in 10th Ed need at least one lone operative unit for objective control at range. And I'm going to put in the same bag as objective control at range, secondary scoring at range, and the mobility helps with that too. So there are a number of secondary tactical scoring options. If you're using the deck for tactical scoring for your secondary missions, many of those require you to perform an action in some place on the board, in a corner of the board. Fully half of them involve you being somewhere and doing a thing. It might even be slightly more than half. And so you need units that can do this, and it's perfectly safe to put your Aeldari Wayleaper out in the open to do an action, to be somewhere to score, but the model is also fast enough that it doesn't take it out of the battle to perform that role. So it's a scoring model in your own backfield, and it can also actually be a scoring model in the midfield. If you jump the Wayleaper onto a midfield objective, but again, because of that lone operative ability, as long as you're keeping your opponent at range, you can use this to control midfield objectives. Now, in order to take that risk, you have to know how fast your opponent's models are, what sort of tricks your opponent might have up her sleeve, and there are also ways to control your opponent's movement. You could, for example, use your Night Spinners to put a movement penalty on enemy units. You might maybe your opponent has one thing that's fast enough that potentially it could oppose, it could get within 12 inches of your Wayleaper on an early turn of the game, and so you focus on targeting that and destroying it, or move blocking it with a unit of hawks or something. There's a lot of ways that you can use lone operative to synergize with other fast units to block the one thing or destroy the one thing that could potentially interfere with you scoring that midfield objective. There's another way that you can score midfield objectives with the Wayleaper, which I'll get to a little bit later using an enhancement. The third thing that the Wayleaper does for you is to provide security in your own backfield. So because the Wayleaper is if you build it well and you use it well, it's a very competent combat unit. It actually has some pretty serious damage output. And once you've moved your one bully unit or your two bully units in the list, your avatar or whatever, down the field, the sorts of units that are good in 10th for craft worlds don't typically involve a lot of melee units or high damage output close combat units that are going to hang around in your backfield. And so having a unit that can in a clutch moment engage with enemy deep strikers or engage with some fast enemy unit that has somehow gotten past your bully units onto your side of the table and is rampaging unchecked, well, there are ways to make the Wayleaper pretty effective against many of the obstacles that you might encounter, or frankly, even if your opponent just drops something like some Nurglings as a scoring unit, or a Ripper Swarm or something, while your Wayleaper's hanging out in your own backfield. It can just murder something like that. That's useful. So it's a security unit and a fallback option that can engage aggressive enemy units that move onto your side of the table. And then lastly, it's an incredibly powerful combat unit in the mid and the late game, particularly in the late game when your opponent doesn't have a lot left on the table, because if you build it well, it's actually good into everything. And then there's some tricks you can pull with it to make it also super deadly while also being hard to kill in the mid game. And I'm going to talk about those tricks when I talk about enhancements. So those are the 4 jobs. Scoring on your side of the table, both objective control and also secondary scoring. CP generation, I should have said that first because that's what I started with. Also some midfield scoring opportunities. And then it's a security unit that cleans up enemy units that deep strike in or get onto your side of the table and need to be stopped or checked. And then it's a murder scalpel in the late game. Let's take a quick look at the stat line and the abilities, and then we'll spend a little more time talking about ideal loadouts, how to build this thing. It has a pretty typical character profile, except it has a movement characteristic of 14 because of the Swooping Hawk wings or the warp generator. Toughness 3, that's normal. 3 up save, would have been nice to have the 2, but 3 is fine. 4 wounds, leadership 6, 1 objective control, so it's got to be alone on the objective to get it. 4 up invuln, that's good. Most of the Aeldari characters have that. And then it has, you could deep strike with it. I think generally you don't want to, for the simple reason that if it's not on the battlefield, it doesn't give you extra CP. So there might be some incredibly rare circumstance in which this would make sense. It's never come up for me. Don't deep strike with it. Lone operative, we've mentioned, amazing. It's like the reason to have it. Has Strands of Fate, of course. And then the only other thing it does besides Path of Command, it has Indomitable Strength of Will, which is a 6-inch aura. Each time a unit takes a battle shock or leadership test within that aura, add 1 to the test. Generally, Battle Shock in 10th edition hasn't been quite as impactful as maybe we initially suspected. I think in general, this is like a nice to have that, frankly, you're going to forget about. You will rarely remember, if ever, that you have this role. The one time, the way the game stands now anyway, where this might actually really matter is if you're playing into certain kinds of Tyrannid lists that are running a Neuro Tyrant, which gives everything -1 to its leadership when they use their special Shadow of the Warp ability and make everybody take a test. And then if your opponent is running a bunch of Neurolictors, which creates synergies with failed battle shock tests, then you really might want to be thinking about where you position your Autarch Wayleaper to prevent those effects from hitting certain units in certain ways. But in general, it's going to be a challenge to even remember that power exists. Okay, let's talk loadouts and the abilities that come with loadouts. It's a single model for 115 points. That's great. I think at that number, it's just inside reasonably priced slim commander character. Once you start thinking about giving it enhancements, you're going to feel the cost a little bit. But 115 is good. That is a good price for this. And I think fair. I don't think it needs some kind of points nerf. It comes default with a Starglaive and a Shuriken pistol, and then you can just give it either a Scorpion helmet or a Banshee helmet, a Banshee mask, or Manda blasters. And of course you're going to do that, because why would you leave something on the table that you could have? So step 1 is you keep the Starglaive. You could swap the Starglaive for another melee weapon, either a Banshee Blade or a Scorpion Chainsword, and the only reasons to do that are narrative. I'm an Ibrasil player. Banshees are the Ibrasil aspect warriors, so in a highly narrative game, I might run my Wayleaper with a Banshee Blade, because probably an Ibrasil Autarch would have one. But unless you have some narrative reason for doing it, you definitely want that Starglaive. The Starglaive gives you 5 attacks. It hits on 3s while the others hit on 2s, but it's strength 6, -2 AP, flat 2 damage. Now, that strength 6 is important because it means that it can wound most tanks and monsters, not the stuff that's toughness 12 and above, on a 5 up, which makes it actually a threat to those things. And doing flat 2 instead of 1, which both the Scorpion Chainsword and the Banshee Blade do, is big. That means that every blow into a enemy bike or an enemy marine is a dead enemy bike or a dead enemy marine. It will also, as we've already established, be much more efficient against hard targets with the extra damage, not just the strength, but also the extra damage. Now, the Banshee Blade will be slightly more effective into highly armored enemy infantry with like good armor. The Banshee Blade would be very effective in a mirror matchup if you had to kill other elves. And then the Scorpion Chainsword gives you 6 attacks instead of 5 and has sustained hits 1, strength 5, but then no AP. The Starglaive is better because it just expands the potential target profiles. With the other two, you're trivially better into a single kind of target, but it's not like the Starglaive is bad at killing light infantry, so that's what you want. And then the Banshee Mask and the Manda Blasters only affect your melee output, so now's the time to talk about those. You choose between Fights First, which is the Banshee Mask ability, or getting devastating wounds when targeting infantry or bikes, so anything that doesn't have the monster or vehicle keyword. Devastating wounds in melee only. Both of these are good. The Howling Banshee Mask is probably better. There is one possible argument for Manda Blasters if you take the Fate's Messenger and Enhancement, which I'll talk about later. But in general, being able to fight first it's so good in 10th edition, and it really changes the way, having the Banshee Mask changes the way that you can play with this unit, because there's all sorts of types of enemy that you no longer really need to worry about being charged by, because in both sections of the combat phase, the units with attack priority and the units that don't have attack priority, in 10th edition, the player whose turn it is not always activates first in both of those sections of the phase. So an opponent charges you, you have the Starglaive, you fight first with the Howling Banshee Mask. The trick to playing this unit well is to use a combination of tactics that just make it very difficult to counter, very difficult to deal with in the later part of the game when there are fewer tools on the field. And the Howling Banshee Mask it's one of those tools. You want the Banshee Mask. But I will make the Manda Blaster argument soon when we talk enhancements. I already said I'm going to do that. Okay, for ranged weapons, obviously you don't want the shuriken pistol that it comes with. Literally everything is better than that. You want the Dragon Fusion gun. I'll briefly tell you about your other options. You could get a Death Spinner, which would give you D6 shots and devastating wounds. They would auto hit, and maybe you would get a devastating wound at strength 4, no AP, 1 damage. You could get a fusion pistol, which is a range of 6. It's a single shot. You hit on 2s, but it's strength 8 minus 4 AP. Melt a 2. It's assault. It's got pistol, D3 damage. The argument for the fusion pistol is that you can shoot it in melee, and if you were planning to be in sustained melee combat with characters and monsters, the fusion pistol might make a lot of sense. It's the best of the other options. But the Dragon Fusion gun is so good that that's going to be the one you want. We'll talk about that in a moment. Excuse me. But if you are playing with that older Autarch model that just came default with the wings and the fusion pistol, it's fine. I wouldn't take it to a GT, but the fusion pistol is not bad. Being able to shoot in melee is good. And obviously in melee, you will always trigger Melta, because you will, if you're in melee combat with something, you're always going to be close enough to do D3 plus 2 instead of just D3. So that's pretty good too. You can give the Autarch Wayleaper the Reaper launcher, like in that cool piece of art that was on the cover of our last codex and is on the index cards. Don't. If you were to run a foot Autarch, that's probably the best pick for the foot Autarch, but don't run a foot Autarch unless you're playing very narratively. The Dragon Fusion gun is fabulous. It has a 12-inch range. It's assault, so you can move your 14 inches plus D6, and of course you could always cheat with a fate die or that stratagem we have to just move 20, and there are ways to move even further. And then you open up with a weapon that hits on 2s, is strength 9, minus 4 AP, d6 damage, but melt to 3. So if you're within 6 inches, d6 plus 3 damage. And of course, you could use a fate die and just automatically do 9 that will go through most armor. And that is really good. And remember that because of our detachment ability, you're getting 1 reroll to hit, 1 reroll to wound, which means even against stuff that's toughness 11 or 12 or higher, you stand a pretty good chance of wounding. And then if there's no invuln save, you're basically just going through the armor. Now, the 12-inch range on the Dragon Fusion gun arguably is a little bit limiting, but I mentioned earlier that there are movement tricks. I should have actually talked about this when I was talking scoring. So you can move your 20 inches if you advance and then use a die. But you can also use Phantasm at the end of your opponent's movement phase to move another 7 for 1 CP. So this thing's really got like you can get around pretty fast. So the limited range on the fusion gun isn't really an issue. It can be a little hard to get within 6 inches of something, but that's why I say typically you think about your Wayleaper as a force multiplier in your own, or an additional force, not really a multiplier, on your own half of the table, not so much on your opponent's half. But you should be able to get close enough on your own half of the table to hit with that Dragon Fusion gun and trigger the Melter rule. So when you're just buying this thing for 115 and outfitting it, generally my suggestion is going to be the Dragon Fusion gun, the Starglaive, and the Banshee Mask. It's pretty great. In addition, there are 2 enhancements, both of which are really good for the Autarch Wayleaper. The first of these is the Phoenix Gem. The Phoenix Gem is 25 points, and when the model is killed, you roll a d6, and on a 2-up, it just resurrects with full wounds, more or less right where it was on the table. You can't put it back into melee engagement with an enemy, otherwise it comes back right where it was, and at the end of the phase. And that end of the phase thing is important on rules like this because it means that an opponent can't double kill your Wayleaper in the shooting phase. 25 points is pretty steep because now instead of being a slim and trim 115 point character, now it's 140 points, which is as expensive as a light tank or a fully fledged combat unit. But it really is arguably worth it because it adds an additional bag of tricks for your Wayleaper. For one thing, you have the opportunity to score a midfield objective in a situation in which you can't totally keep it safe from enemy shooting. So the Lone Operative ability will often make it possible for you to score a midfield objective with this thing if your opponent is running a list that's slow or a little bit conservative in its movement. But even in a situation in which that is not the case, where your opponent has units that can get within 12 inches of the Wayleaper, if you have the Phoenix Gem and you really need to score the objective, you have an opportunity to jump on the objective, figure, yes, my opponent probably can kill me with volume of fire, which is in fact the way to kill the Wayleaper. It's not scared of like a Dark Lance or something because with our Fate dice, right, we can always auto succeed on a saving throw. What's going to get you is a bunch of stuff that's strength 4 minus 1 AP hitting you on 3s. And if your Wayleaper goes down to that kind of firepower, it's not a big deal. You just, on a 2-up, you stand it back up, you score the objective, and that might not sound like a big deal to you, especially you newer players, but the ability to pull that trick on an objective can swing the whole game if it's a close game, because it means that at the beginning of your opponent's turn, you will have one more objective, which means they won't have more than you. Sometimes that's an important scoring mechanic. It also means that on your own turn, you're going to be scoring an additional objective, and sometimes it also has good synergy with secondary scoring, which requires you to take some objective in the midfield or something like that. The other thing that the Phoenix Gem does for the Wayleaper is it gives you the opportunity to play more aggressively into enemy units, sometimes to move block something big and bad and scary, even if it means doing that 27-inch move with Phantasm. Phantasm happens at the end of your opponent's movement phase, but you could block an enemy charge, which would be really useful potentially in some situations. And if you block a charge with your Wayleaper, then it fights first if it has the Banshee Mask, which is pretty cool. And you don't have to worry about it dying. It also, the Phoenix Gem gives you an opportunity to use your Wayleaper like a torpedo on your own side of the field if your opponent is able to get something past your bully unit, say past your Avatar of Cain, past your Wraithguard maybe, onto your side of the table, something that's pretty scary, pretty durable, that's like a player of a unit, that can be hard for Eldar to deal with. Really, one of the only things that we really dislike, we dislike really effective indirect fire, and we dislike units that are as fast as we are. It can be a real issue. So, for example, one of the factions that's really powerful right now, that's also playing close to the top of the meta, is Chaos Space Marines. And although it's overall in Chaos Space Marine lists probably a B+ unit because it's a little overcosted, I think, the Demon Prince with wings is still something that sometimes turns up in successful tournament lists. That is not something that you want flying over your Avatar of Cain and suddenly being on your half of the table threatening your own backfield. So the ability to suddenly pop out with your Wayleaper, shoot the Demon Prince with a fusion gun that if they don't make their saving throw, you're going to hit on 2s, reroll the wound. If they fail their save, you can auto do 9 damage with it with a fate die, with the Melter rule, and then you can charge it, be in melee with it, probably survive melee with some combination of fate dice, or just maybe you even have to use lightning fast, and then still be there holding it up on your opponent's turn. But even if you do get killed, you stand back up. And even if you do get killed when you charge the thing in melee, if the dice just don't go your way, your opponent then can't shoot your Wayleaper because of the lone operative rule. So it's kind of okay that it's out in the open. And if the Demon Prince charges again on your opponent's turn after you charged on yours, it's kind of okay because you can fight first with the Banshee Mask. Also, you can do another thing, which I'll talk about in a moment, potentially, if you choose a different build. So let's talk about the different build. It's possible that you don't want to give the Phoenix Gem to the Wayleaper. Maybe you don't have the points. Maybe you just don't want to invest that much in this particular model, or maybe you need to give the Phoenix Gem to a different model. I often like to give mine to my Farseer, so if I'm really counting on the toughness buff from the Farseer, I don't want my Farseer in certain matchups being killed by indirect fire. Usually it takes a couple turns to chew through a Farseer and cover with indirect fire, but if you give the Phoenix Gem, it's like, well, if it takes 2 turns to chew through it with indirect fire, do you see what I mean? It's alive pretty much to the end of the game. So it can be a great pick for a Farseer. So if you don't have the Phoenix Gem available for whatever reason, you may want to consider Fate's Messenger. This has some advantages that the Phoenix Gem doesn't. So what Fate's Messenger does is once per player turn, after either a hit roll, a wound roll, or an armor saving throw, you can treat the result of the roll as an unmodified 6. So you get to roll the die first, which is important. That's way better than like I have to decide before I roll. Now there's an incredibly cool trick that you can do with this, but I'll talk about the less incredibly cool obvious benefits first. So the obvious ways in which you might use this, obviously in the shooting phase, because with our detachment bonus we already get a reroll to hit and a reroll to wound. You're almost guaranteed, there's like a 1 in 36 chance you miss with that fusion gun, so you probably don't need to use it there. But on the wound roll, theoretically, if you were to roll to wound and then use your detachment reroll to wound when you failed to wound and still not wound, if you're into something really tough, you could just auto wound something that was like toughness 12 with your fusion gun. A few of you might be thinking to yourself, Brent, there's a difference between a roll and a reroll. There have been GT judges in various editions in various places in the world that have decided this, and while you are right, in 10th edition this year at some of the biggest tournaments in 40k, the judges ruled that rerolls are in fact rolls. They're not ontologically different from regular rolls. which has important implications for powers like Fate's Messenger. Also theoretically for Fate dice. But there is, people still debate that. Practically speaking, though, what this means is that if you've failed also on your reroll, you could then use the power to just treat whatever you rolled the second time as a 6. And then, of course, the most obvious way that you might use this on your opponent's turn is just to auto-succeed on an armor save that you just failed, so you don't have to worry about using a Fate die or something when your Wayleaper gets blasted with a Dark Lance. I don't know why I have Dark Lances on my mind. It's not like we're worried about playing into Drakari at the moment. But there's some other ways in which Fate's Messenger is just absolutely amazing. Here's my straight up favorite Wayleaper trick. Here it is. You move your Wayleaper aggressively into the midfield. You probably jump on an objective, or you jump close enough to some enemy unit that you can annihilate it with your fusion gun or seriously damage it with your fusion gun. And maybe even follows up and kill something in melee. But then your Wayleaper is sitting out there exposed to your opponent's army. Now, if you're really doing this trick in a way that's clever, you'll try to set it up so that the units that are easiest to then oppose the Wayleaper with, that are close, like fast enough to get close to it, are something that would be vulnerable to a fusion gun, like a character, a light tank, a monster would be great. Now, in order to either shoot you or to charge you, your opponent has to move within 12 inches, which means within range of the fusion gun. You now spend a CP on Overwatch to fire the fusion gun. Now, Overwatch, you only hit on 6s, but you get your natural reroll for our detachment bonus, which works in all phases. And then because you have Fate's Messenger, in the event that you were to miss both times, not get a 6 either time, you just treat whatever you roll the second time as a 6. So you just auto hit with the fusion gun at strength 9 minus 4 AP, d6 damage, d6 plus 3 if they're within melter range. And then at the end of your opponent's movement phase, you spend a CP on Phantasm and you move the Wayleaper 7 inches. And if you've done this right and you know the movement value of your opponent's units and you've really planned it out, you finish outside of 12 inches after you make the Phantasm move, such that the Wayleaper is just completely untargetable. So you just got a free shot at something with the fusion gun and potentially did a bunch of damage, and then you ran away. And now there's nothing they can do. And in the event that you didn't need the auto 6 to hit, because in your initial 2 rolls you got a 6, you could potentially use the if you fail your reroll of your wound roll, you could just wound automatically. Now that Phantasm trick works even if you don't have Fate's Messenger. You can get aggressive with the Wayleaper, wait for something to move close enough to it to try to engage it, and then just kind of run away with Phantasm. And then whatever your opponent thought they were potentially trading for the Wayleaper, because probably that's the deal, now you just get for free. You can probably kill whatever that is, and there's nothing that they can do to the Wayleaper, which is great. The other advantage to having Fate's Messenger over the Phoenix Gem is in melee. Strength 6 just, even with a reroll, it doesn't really get you there against stuff that's really tough, but if you get to roll all of your dice to wound and then do 1 reroll and then also change one of your 1s to a 6 to wound, that's really useful in making the melee profile of the Autarch Wayleaper better into hard targets. And here actually is the argument for at least considering the Manda Blasters. I think the only reason to take the Manda Blasters is that you're going with Fate's Messenger. This does actually open up something interesting. Because should you find yourself in melee, you will have an opportunity if you roll 5 dice to hit with 1 reroll. You're probably going to hit with 4 of them, maybe even all 5. And then the Manda Blasters only trigger against bikes and infantry, so you're going to wound most stuff on 3s, and then you're going to get a reroll, and then you're going to be able to treat one of your dice as a 6, which means on average you're going to get 2 6s, and if you have the Manda Blasters, that will push through 2 attacks with devastating wounds, which will just like automatically kill a couple of Marines or bikes before they even take armor saves, or let you automatically kill a Terminator or whatever. I think what prevents this from being a serious competitor with the Banshee Mask is that it doesn't work on tanks and monsters, which is where you'd really want to be able to push the devastating wounds through. But for those of you who really love striking scorpions and would love to have the Scorpion Mask for thematic reasons, it's a thing to think about. Or maybe if you're in a very particular kind of a meta. And then lastly, in the late game, right? So regardless of whether or not you've given your Autarch the Phoenix Gem or Fate's Messenger, or you're pulling these various tricks, even if you use this model fairly conservatively the way a newer player might and have it sit in your own backfield, just be a lone operative on an objective and provide you with extra CP. And not just newer players. So there's plenty of circumstances in which I do that in my games too. There's just not a good opening to do something else, but often there is. But even if all your if you have a vanilla Wayleaper for 115 points kind of sitting out the game for the first few turns, in the late game there's little enough left on your opponent's side of the table probably that you really can start getting aggressive with this, and it can be kind of a beat stick. Also, with the fusion gun and the Starglaive build, it's a threat to everything. It's like your opponent doesn't want a tank to be near this. Your opponent doesn't want a unit of Marines or a Terminator squad that's already taken some damage. Maybe a full Terminator squad would be okay, but it's the end of the game, so there's two Terminators left in the squad, maybe three. They don't really want to be near a Wayleaper. And one of the things that happens in competitive 40k is that you look at your opponent's list and you look at what you have and you say to yourself, well, what do I need to get rid of? Do I need to get rid of the majority of their anti-tank weapons so that my avatar can stomp all over them and my Night Spinners and Fire Prisms can come out into the open and score midfield objectives? Do I need to destroy their highly mobile units? Do I need to, which by the way, as an Eldar player, usually that's the answer, you destroy their highly mobile units. Do I need to take out their melee threats? There's probably something your opponent has that if you could take away without losing the thing that it counters, maybe wins you the game. And your opponent's going to be thinking about your list in the same way. And one of the nice things about the Autarch Wayleaper is it has a loadout for everything. It's not great into hordes, but melee does happen on both players' turns. So even against a horde unit, it'll do some work. Maybe not a horde unit that also resurrects, but against pretty much everything in the game, it's a late game tool that you can be guaranteed to have that you can use to counter whatever your opponent has left over. It just makes it harder to take away all of your tools. Before I wrap up, I'm going to briefly talk about obstacles to using the Wayleaper well. And normally when I do this, I talk about stuff that you have to play around to make the unit function effectively, and that's just not the case with the Wayleaper. The greatest obstacle to using the Wayleaper well is that it's kind of a Ferrari. It's a high skill cap unit that will reward knowledgeable, skilled play that involves not only knowing your own rules, but knowing what your opponent's units can do and being able to think a move or two ahead tactically about movement and damage and scoring. And so newer players might find it tough just because of the learning curve. And the way to get better at that is to get reps in, to practice. It can also help if you're a newer player to make a battle plan, like make a list of stuff before you play a match, especially if you're running a new list that you don't want to forget about. You might not even have to look at this. Just the experience of writing down the stuff that you don't want to forget will often help you to remember it. You do have to be a little bit careful about knowing how far your opponent's units can actually move. It's also totally fine to ask an opponent, hey, do you have any tricks that can make that thing faster? It's bad sportsmanship not to answer a question like that. 40k is not really supposed to be a game of gotcha. It's one thing if there's just so much to keep track of that you make a play error, you forget a thing, you forget your opponent can do a thing. It's another thing to just really not know. So you don't want to leave the Wayleaper in a situation where something can get so close to it that you can't phantasm away and it can be killed. Even in a situation like that, you could theoretically still pull the Overwatch trick. And if you had the Phoenix Gem, it'd be a little bit more forgiving, but you have to be a little careful. That said, when I posted the early access version of this content to my Discord, one of my patrons, whom I rely on to point out oversights, did have two contributions. He pointed out that if you happen to be playing into Thousand Suns, their Doombolt Cabal ritual has an 18-inch range and doesn't count as shooting, and therefore can target stuff with lone operative. And if they have a Vortex Beast, this goes apparently to 36 inches. I haven't come up against the Vortex Beast thing in 10th ed, but thanks, Mike. That's a good tip. He also personally mentioned that he has occasionally simply been obliterated with 12-inch flamers, having the Wayleaper get too close to a 12-inch flamer. And this is, of course, because if your opponent triggers Overwatch, you have to be within 12 inches to use your fusion gun. And if you just moved there at the end of your movement phase, your opponent triggers Overwatch and just auto hits you. So, yeah. Watch out for torrent weapons and be a little careful if you play into Thousand Suns of that Doombolt Cabal ritual. But otherwise, the biggest problem that you're going to have, I suspect, if you're a newer player, is just you're ready to drive a Toyota Corolla really well, and the Wayleaper is a Ferrari that you just borrowed from your friend in high finance. It might take you a little while to get the hang of it. So there it is. I mean, the Autarch Wayleaper is just one awesome elf. It generates extra CP for you. It allows you to score both primaries and secondaries on your half of the table. In the hands of a skilled veteran player, it can be a midfield scoring unit that is difficult to counter and get rid of, that also performs these like weird surgical, tactical, unanswerable hit and runs, where it can be a deterrent for like a bunch of units in your opponent's army that like don't want to get near this one elf with a fusion gun for fear that he will ignite them, automatically do 9 damage with a fate die, and then run away. And then the Wayleaper is also this like late game ninja beat stick that has ways of fighting just about anything. And the whole time it's also providing security for you in your own backfield against deep strikers and whatever else. So it's just great. If you haven't already added one of these to your Warhost, I strongly recommend it. It's one of those models that everybody, I think, should have in their collection if they're Aeldari players. And if you already have one, hopefully at least something I said was new to you. So that's what I've got. If you liked this video, I hope that you will click like. If you've not yet subscribed, I hope that you will subscribe. If you have your own ideas about how to use the Aeldari Wayleaper effectively, I hope that you will leave a comment below, or you could leave a comment below just to say hello, or I liked that, which both helps my algorithm and my ego. Although I would like to be so enlightened that I simply didn't need positive feedback to remain motivated. I am a material elf living in a material craft world. And like Harlequins, I like applause. So if you really wanted to support the channel, you could become a patron. My patrons have special access to a Discord. They get early access to some content. There are other benefits too. I will link my Patreon in the video description. That's all for now. Back again soon with new content. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye.